So from here, I lined up where I want to cut and splice the wires to connect to the recharge port. So now we'll go and splice them and solder them on. Next, we need to splice in another 22 AWG red hot wire that's going to go from the battery back out to the Neopixel. While this hot lead from the battery is going to go to the recharge port, and so is this negative. Okay, so that connection went well. And I have the battery wrapped in a little bit of a plastic in case it explodes or leaks. But splicing's done, and let's put a piece of shrink tubing on it. Okay, the recharge port is completely wired up. We have the positive lead coming off the battery going to this tab, and we also have a separate hot lead in a smaller 28 gauge size that goes to the positive pad on the Profi board, which is the main board that controls all the lighting and effects and sounds, etc. Over here, we have the negative lead from the battery, and then we also have a separate negative tab that has its own wire that will go up to the negative pad on the Profi board. So making progress. Yep, looks very professional. I put one extra heat shrink tube on the RCP itself, on the recharge port, so that when it's in the chassis, it can't make contact with anything metal like the hilt on the outside. Okay, this came out pretty good. You can see all the wires are in place, and only a negative's facing the outward area, but again, it has some extra protection there. Recharge port is hooked up. I think we're all done with this piece. That red and black wire sitting right here are going to the Profi board, which is going to sit right here. I guess I can demonstrate that. I have a burned out Profi board that I use just for testing. With the test Profi board in place, you can see that the red and black wires that go from the recharge port to the Profi board have almost no distance to go, and they'll be wired up from underneath. So will everything else. So everything gets wired onto this, and this will get glued down into this channel right here. Okay, the speaker is wired, and it's going to go inside of the speaker housing, which has a special connection to connect to the speaker Pogo Pins to turn the speaker on when you plug the Pommel in, which I'll show you later. So the speaker is partially pre-wired and glued into the speaker housing, which goes inside the Pommel. The interesting thing is these two green wires will get connected to that PCB, that little tiny round PCB board, and then that board gets glued into this spot. That board makes a connection with those two pins, which will be sticking out that little rectangle right there above the recharge port in the chassis. So when you pull the speaker, when you unscrew the Pommel and take the Pommel off to recharge or to access the Profi board, it will disconnect. When you screw it on, it connects. It's pretty cool because there's not a wire. It's connection based like Pogo Pins. Those little pins right there, you can see that's my finger. Look how little they are. Those little pins will make a connection, and that's what powers the speaker. Very cool. Okay, so the speaker is firmly glued into the speaker chassis, and the speaker chassis is firmly glued into the coupler that goes between the saber hilt and the Pommel. So this is going to go into the Pommel in the end. But before that, I need to connect this very small PCB for the speaker onto these two wires and then glue that little PCB disc into that opening. Okay, so it looks like I have two good soldered connections for the speaker PCB, and I just need to then glue it into this opening. Okay, so the speaker PCB board snapped into place with a little click, so I think it's really a press fit. So from here, the next step is to install the speaker housing, the speaker chassis, into the Pommel. So before installing it, I've screwed in one of these small nylon grub screws, which will help keep the Pommel from unscrewing off this side. So I've got it screwed down a quarter of the way, and with the nylon grub screw just sticking out a little bit, causes friction and slows down the turning. So I think it might work, but let's screw it all the way down and see what it does. Okay, well, that worked pretty well. I just hope I don't have to unscrew it because it didn't go down 100%. It went down most of the way, which I'm just going to leave for now. But that little nylon screw, that grub screw, really made it hard to unscrew, which is, in the end, if there's no problems with the speaker and it all works, it's good because this is how you want it to come off. Okay, so I'm preparing the Neopixel Pcb that connects to the blades. On the opposite side that goes to the hilt, you can see here I've bridged the R2 and the J pad, which you can see around 10 o'clock. All the other bubbles or blobs that you see of solder are connecting these Pogo pins. So now that the Neopixel PCB is done and all the pins are straight, I'm going to push them through the holes in this lens. And again, the lens does two things. It keeps the pins straight when the base of the saber blade connector touches them. And two, it allows these 5 bonus LEDs to shine through in a diffused fashion. And they're only used when the blade's out. All right. It's snapped on real nice and clean. I have the Neopixel PCB wires routed through the chassis, coming out the emitter side. And you can see there's a positive, negative, and a purple for data. On the PCB itself, which you can see compared to my finger is very small. Again, this is the part that connects the other side, or have the pins that connect to the saber. You can use any positive or negative. However, for the data port, you want to use the data 2 pad right here. And I'm probably going to use that positive and that negative. So I've got the wires already stripped, pre-tinned, and ready to go. It took me numerous times to get these right, but I've got some solid welds here. And I think we're done with the PCB. And here it is with the Neopixel cover put back on. So this one's all set. Technically we could push it into the chassis, but definitely best practice is to leave it out until you've tested everything. We get the Profi installed and everything looks good, then we'll work these wires in and get it pushed in from there. So there we go. So next we're going to solder on 2 green wires for the speakers onto the little speaker Pogo connector, which goes right in this little rectangle area here. And there's this super tiny part. And I've got to solder these 2 connectors on. This is really tiny, so I'm going to be very careful. Okay, it looks like we have 2 solid connections here. I was a little concerned because I was hoping that the housing of this little tiny part wasn't plastic, and it's definitely not. It would have melted or been damaged. But, yep, so this looks good, and we'll move on to the next step. So the next step is to slide this Pogo pin adapter into this rectangular spot. There we go. And press it in and see if it snaps into place. Okay, I realized you had to push it in from this end, not from the inside out, from the outside going in. But if you can see that, it lines up perfect. The Khal over at KR Sabers designed this chassis, and he did a really amazing job because these parts all line up very nicely without a flaw. It's spot on, as you can see. So those 2 pins, they're Pogo pins, and so they go in a little bit. You can't see, but they do. They push in a tiny bit so that when the speaker PCB comes in and touches it, they'll push in a tiny bit so that there's no pressure involved and it makes a good connection. So that part's done. Now to wire up this rat's nest to the Profi board. Okay, it's all wired up, the Profi board that is. I put a little bit of glue in the battery just there and there. E6000 is kind of like a silicone glue just to hold it still. Alright, so the Profi board has been glued down into its little cradle area. Wiring looks good. The wirings sticking out here are for the buttons. But everything's nice and neat. You can see the little Pogo pins there. And of course, the Neopixel PCB's not pushed in yet. I'm going to test first, and once everything's working, I'll push that in. But next I need to just slide in the SD card, which will go right there. So the PCB is now in, and you can see switch 1 is actually this button. So switch 1 on the board will turn the saber off and on, and switch 2, which is this button, is auxiliary. So all I have to do now is wire switch 1 and switch 2 to the board and the ground. So the next step is to solder these little tiny button switches onto this PCB, onto these 4 posts, these little pads. So I use blue tape to initially line it up on the 4 pads and the helping hands tool. You can see on the right the 2 pads have a decent solder connection, and on the left they're not soldered yet. So I put a little bit of flux on them. Okay, I got all 4 done, and I'll clean up the PCB here with this special cleaner. Okay, it looks like we have good solder blobs on each pad, and you can see on the back you have to solder in your ground and then a lead for switch 1 and a lead for switch 2 back to the main board. So I just tinned the 3 pads on the switch PCB, and I'm going to temporarily connect the ground, switch 1 and switch 2 wires, and upload the configs and do a test. Here we go. Okay, I've got the 3 wires temporarily hooked up. Now we can do a test. Okay, looks like it's definitely working. So from here I just need to push the Neopixel PCB all the way back in and get it loaded up into the hilt. So the Neopixel PCB went in real nice. I use a little flat file right there to gently push just around the edges because those Pogo pins are very, very delicate. They're just like thin copper. The next step is to slide this into the hilt, and pull this wire out and try to wire up the switches. I don't know how, but I somehow was able to fish the wires through using this paperclip tool the first time. That's pretty awesome. All right, I just did a test. The speaker did work. The next step is to get, it's all going to be very tight. I'm not exactly sure how this is going to happen because of the wire, but the PCB for the switches goes into this little switch housing, the aluminum switch housing, and then it has to connect to the saber. So I added some liquid tape to these connectors because they're going to come in contact with the switch housing, which is aluminum. So I finally did get the switch housing to go on with the wires underneath. Noting once you get this on, the way you have to set the wire, you will not get the Profi board out far enough, or should I say the chassis out far enough, to be able to push the reset or boot buttons on the Profi. You will literally have to come in here and desolder the connections to the PCB and pull, in order to pull the chassis out far enough. You do need a piece of black electrical tape right on the hilt under the red button, and that's actually where the wires will go. Otherwise, even with putting some plasti dip on the pads on the PCB, they will still short out on the hilt. Same thing with the top. The top of the buttons, tactical buttons, need a good amount of plasti dip around the sides. Again, this has been a great build. The only hard part was here, but I would suggest using 32 AWG wire. I was using 30, but great looking hilt, feels good in the hand, and that's it. Thanks for watching.
I'm going to end this once and for all. A Sith Lord. This party's over.